At the end of World War II, the age of colonialism was officially ended for most of these conquerors, and what grew from that end was a rebirth of those people and their culture, which just went to show that their people were never really subdued in the first place. And then there were some countries that either never stopped fighting in the first place or have been constantly fighting for their right to exist since they won their independence. Some of them overcame great odds and earned the respect of their neighbors and former enemies rather than allow themselves to be subject to someone just because they didn't have the latest in military technologies. Today, we bring you the list of small countries which took on great powers and came out on top. Number 5. Philippines. The 7,000+ islands of the Philippines are not a country that any invader should look forward to subduing. For 300+ years, people of the Philippines were largely not thrilled to be under Spanish rule, which led to a number of insurrections, mutinies, and outright revolts against the Spanish. As a matter of fact, for the entire duration of Spanish colonialism in the Philippines, the Maraon Sulu and Mindanao fought their occupiers. By the time the people of the Philippines rose up to throw off the chains of Spanish colonizers, this revolution continued until the Spanish-American War, when the Americans wrested the island nation away, much to the chagrin of the Philippines. Freedom fighters in the Philippines were so incensed at the American occupation that U.S. troops had to adopt a new sidearm with a larger caliber. Mirror fighters shot by the standard-issue Colt .38 caliber M1892 Army-Navy pistol would not stop rushing American troops, and the U.S. troops in the Philippines were getting killed by lack of firepower. The Philippines created a government anyway and immediately declared war on the United States, and even though it ended with the capture of rebel leader Emilio Aguinaldo, American troops would be in the Philippines until 1913, attempting to subdue guerrillas in the jungles and outlying islands. The actual armed forces of the Philippines might be a little aged and weak. Anyone trying to invade and subdue the Philippines can pretty much expect the same level of resistance from the locals. Number 4, Japan. One of the world's oldest civilizations, Japan was able to keep its culture and history relatively intact over the centuries because mainland Japan has never been invaded by an outside force. Contrary to popular belief, the divine wind typhoons didn't destroy the Mongol fleets outright. Mongol invaders were able to land on some of the Japanese islands, but after a few victories and a couple of stunning defeats, the Japanese exhausted the Mongols and they were forced to retreat back to their ships. Mongols invaded again less than 7 years later with a fleet of 4,400 ships and some 140,000 Mongol, Korean, and Chinese troops. Japanese samurai defending Hakata Bay were not going to wait for the enemy to land and actually boarded Chinese ships to slaughter its mariners. Since then, the Bushido Code only grew in importance and Japan's main enemies were the Japanese. But once Japan threw off its feudal system and unified, it became a force to be reckoned with. Although the attack on Pearl Harbor was not a great idea, the Japanese made sure the Americans knew that any invasion of Japanese territory would cost them dearly. The United States got the message, opting to drop nuclear weapons on Japan to force a surrender rather than attempt an invasion. Even though the US got the demanded surrender, Japan was not a conquered country. The United States left Japan after 7 years of occupation and the understanding that communism was worse than petty fighting. Since the end of World War II, Japan has worked not to dominate the region militarily but economically. Japan's booming economy has allowed the country to meet the threats raised by Chinese power in the region, boosting military spending by $40 billion and creating the world's most technologically advanced, and fifth largest, air force, making any approach to the island that much more difficult. Number 3, Israel. Israel has had mandatory military service for all its citizens since 1949, and for a good reason. Israel is in a tough neighborhood and most of their neighbors don't want Israel to exist. This means the Jewish state is constantly fighting for survival in some way, shape, or form, and they're incredibly good at it. In almost 70 years of history, Israel earned a perfect war record. Wars against Israel don't last long, with most lasting less than a year and the shortest lasting just 6 days. As far as invading Israel goes, the last time an invading army was in Israel proper, it was during the 1948-49 War of Independence. Since then, the farthest any invader got inside Israel was into areas seized by the Israelis during a previous war. More than just securing their land borders, Israel keeps a watchful eye on Jewish people worldwide, and doesn't mind violating another country's sovereignty to do it. Just ask Uganda, Sudan, Argentina, Germany, Norway, France, Italy, UAE, Tunisia. Get the point? If a group of Jewish people are taken hostage or under threat somewhere, the IDF or Mossad will come and get them out. Any country even thinking about invading Israel is probably full of, if not run by, Mossad agents. Israel will get the entire plan of attack in plenty of time to hand an invader their own ass. Just before the 1967 Six-Day War, Mossad agent Eli Cohen became a close advisor to Syria's defense minister. He actually got the Syrians to plant trees in the Golan Heights to help IDF artillery find the range on their targets. Number 2, Finland. Though not much about early Finnish history is known, there are a few Vikings sagas that mention areas of Finland and the people who inhabit those areas. Those sagas usually involve Vikings getting murdered or falling in battle. In the intervening years, Finns allowed themselves to be dominated by Sweden and Russia, but after receiving their autonomy in 1917, Finland wasn't about to give it up. They eventually became a republic and were happy with that situation until around World War II began. That's when the Soviet Union invaded. The invasion of Finland didn't go well for the USSR. It lasted all of 105 days, and the Winter War, as it came to be called, was the site of some of the most brutal fighting the world has ever seen to this day. Finns were ruthless and relentless in defending their territory. For example, the Ratinti incident involved a 300 Finn ambush of a 25,000-strong Soviet force, and the Finns destroyed the Russians almost to the last man. The Finnish sniper Simo Häyhä killed 505 Russians. When the retreating Finns destroyed anything that might be of use to an invader, it forced Soviet troops to march over frozen lakes. Lakes that were mined by the Finns and subsequently exploded, downing and freezing thousands of Red Army invaders. The Winter War is also where Finnish civilians perfected and mass-produced the Molotov cocktail. This was the level of resistance from a country of just 3.5 million people. Number 1, Vietnam. The history of Vietnam's formidable people and defenses date well before the Vietnam War and even before World War II. Vietnam has historically been thought of as one of the most militaristic countries in the region, and for good reason. Vietnam was first invaded by the French in force in 1858, and they couldn't subdue the whole of the country until 1887, 29 years after it first started. It cost thousands of French lives, and the French even had to bring in Philippine troops to help. Even then, they won only because of a critical error on the part of Vietnamese Emperor Duke, who terribly misjudged how much his people actually cared for his regime. The Japanese invasion during WW2 awakened the Vietnamese resolve toward independence, and they immediately started killing Japanese invaders, and not out of love for the French. They famously gave France the boot, invaded Laos to extend their territory, and then invaded South Vietnam. That's where the Americans come in. The American-Vietnam War didn't go so well for either side, but now Communist Vietnam's dense jungle and support from China and the Soviet Union gave the North Vietnamese the military power to match their will to keep fighting, a will which seemed never-ending. Vietnam's resistance to outsiders doesn't end there. After Vietnam invaded, China backed Cambodia and won. Communist China's seemingly unstoppable People's Liberation Army with its seemingly unlimited manpower invaded Vietnam in 1979. For 3 weeks, the war ground Vietnamese border villages in a bloody stalemate until the Chinese retreated back across the border, taking an unexpectedly high death toll. If you enjoy the video, it would be great if you like, share and subscribe.